Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Tyler here and myself, Brad, and this is going to be part two of a three-part series in the current state of Microsoft 365 attacks. And so we're really just kind of stepping through all the different mechanisms by which we frequently use and attackers use to compromise, enumerate, gain initial access, all that good stuff. And so in this particular episode, we're talking about initial access. How do we break into M365 environments typically? And so before we get into that, quick admin, if you guys like what we're doing, the best thing you can do is like, share, subscribe, rate us on the podcast platform that you're using. But really just kind of sharing the word is the best thing you can do. So we really appreciate you guys for that. So Tyler, you're our external pen testing dude, right? So tell me about, um, you know, the probably the most common attack, right? The thing that we use the most. I guess the first three in our list kind of all roll up into one. But yeah, let's dive into it.
Yeah, I'd say your biggest avenue, your most common avenue is going to be credential based attacks, which
Mhm.
is all what our first 3 points are surrounded around. So we start with credential stuffing. Um, I think the misconception with credential stuffing is that it's hard to get breach passwords because they're either paywalled behind expensive things like recorded future, to go out to the dark web and find those for you, or you have to go visit dark web yourself. But there's plenty of resources out there that will divulge plenty of stolen credentials that have been leaked from data breaches to you for relatively
Mhm.
cheap.
Yeah, and those passwords, just to give a little context around them, 99% of the time, those passwords are not being disclosed as a result of a direct attack on the company that we're targeting. They're usually a third-party application, website, something like that, that is often unrelated to the business itself. Like there was a really big parking app that got popped a little while back. We get a lot of great passwords from those. Online websites like retail sites, things like that that get compromised, databases get extorted, things like that. And so really what we're leveraging here is, and you and I were talking about this pre-show, and it's just users like to reuse passwords, right? Because it's human nature, it's easier. And so we frequently find that the passwords these users are using in other places are also maybe being used in the workplace. Um, and so with that said, though, most of the time these are aged out, right? Most of the
Yep.
time the passwords are older that are sitting out on the dark web.
Yeah, I think this is kind of a twofold issue as well because it speaks to users using corporate accounts for non-corporate activities, websites, whatever. And then when those websites get popped, those corporate accounts and passwords get thrown into those huge files sold on the dark web, and then they end up in our dirty hands, a few weeks later.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the timing kind of has to be right there. Some of the largest organizations that we've compromised though have been on really old accounts that still had passwords set. Maybe they're set not to expire for whatever reason. I think in one case the user had actually left the organization, and for whatever reason the password enforcement reset policy hadn't applied to them, and so it was like a 3-year-old user that had been gone for a while, and they happened to have gotten a password compromise that matched their corporate password at the time. So,
Yep.
um, so credential stuffing, we do that on 100% of our externals, right across the board. So it's kind of hit and miss, but we do frequently hit on those. What other kind of password user credential attacks are you seeing?
I think a less common one, um, just because of the nature of it, it's brute forcing.
Yeah.
You can't really do that from a user's email perspective because you will end up locking hundreds or thousands of accounts depending on organization size. But, when you're looking at certain ports and protocols that don't have those lockout policies set, like SSH, FTP, and you're trying to authenticate to those, that's really where brute force attacks play into. But, in the realm of Microsoft, where do you think we're seeing brute force attacks?
We're not. We're not seeing it. I mean, I can't think of any cases. It's like you said, the problem with the brute force attack, for those of you that don't know, is it's a systematical way of stepping through a series of numbers and values and special characters or whatever, and you usually start with all A's, and then it's A, B, A, or whatever, and you kind of step through it slowly. The problem is it doesn't really match what we're seeing passwords set to. So it's extraordinarily inefficient to do something like that. And when you start working in Microsoft defensive mechanisms, you start working in the delays of just sending that request over the web and back, then it just doesn't work, man. And so,
I
like,
can think of one avenue where this may be useful, and it's if you have certain endpoints exposed, like NTLM endpoints,
yeah,
and you
that's a good
want to
point.
attack with accounts that can't be locked out, like certain administrator accounts.
Oh yeah,
You could launch brute force attacks on those login pages, since certain administrator accounts, you don't set the lockout so that if every account in your environment gets locked out, you still have one.
yep.
So that could be a specific avenue for attack, but you know in terms of M365 as a whole, I'd say brute force is going to be your least common attack, just for
Mhm.
the fact that you are going to lock accounts.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. We see it in RDP a lot as well. We'll see RDP do brute force attacks because there's no timeout, there's not a lot of protections, and if
Yep.
you can RDP in with admin, you're not going to get locked. So, all right. So the most common attack that we see, which I mean, I kind of roll credential stuffing into password spraying, which is the most common attack that we see, just because it tends to be the front end of a password spray, if that makes sense. Like,
Right.
I'm gonna go scrape up all those compromised passwords. I'm gonna blast them. If I don't get anything, I'm rolling directly into a password spray. And so for the listeners, what's the difference between a credential stuffing and a password spraying attack?
Yeah. So when you credential stuff, you have specific account and credentials that you found from, an external resource that you want to go into an application and try. When you're doing a password spray, you're taking a large list of usernames and you're sending a certain password against every single one of those usernames. And typically, to avoid lockout policies, this is done like once an hour, every hour. In weird cases, organizations have 5 passwords, bad passwords within a 24-hour period. So you really
Yeah.
just have to adjust it, per organization.
hmm Yep, absolutely agree with that. And I would say, from a success perspective, what are your odds up on credential stuffing versus password spraying? I would say password spraying is a little bit more effective, probably by
Yeah, just
a
because you
read.
have a larger surface that you can password spray with
Yeah.
than, with credential stuffing, since it's a lot more specific.
Yeah, and I'll also say, actually, you just hit on something that's really important too, and that is the more users you have in your environment, the more likely we are to be successful with password spraying, right? Because we're using passwords that are playing on human behavior. Summer 2024, a variation of the company name. I think you got one this week, right?
Yep.
Which was a variant on the name of the company, and so it was like company, I don't know, 1 2 3 4.
2024 exclamation point. Yep.
There you go. And so, we understand users just want easy passwords they can remember. That just makes our job a little bit easier.
Well, another thing, I saw another organization. There was a user that needed their password reset by IT, and IT had a certain password they sent to those users so that they could
Yep.
reset their accounts.
Yep.
Um, and it was password 123 exclamation point. And
Rough.
so using that, we were able to get that user's account just because they were in that gap period between IT sending them their password and them resetting it.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. That's happened a couple of times actually, and it's even more common on internals, where there are certain types of accounts that have multiple accounts will have the same password.
Yep.
And so when we compromise one password, we turn around and we spray all the accounts with it, and we can almost always pick up a couple of extras. So we can't really talk about password and credential attacks without addressing MFA. And so I think we should probably just quickly talk about the evolution of MFA, how it matters, et cetera. Um, you know, just a level set, MFA is the third component of authentication, right? You have a username, you have a password. MFA is something that you have as opposed to something that you know. A password and a username is something that you know. And so, how do we well, first of all, there are multiple kinds of MFA. Let's talk about that really quickly, right? So, like, MFA is not created equal across the board. And so, what are some of the gaps that you're seeing in current implementations of MFA? And then we'll talk about, bypass mechanisms that we use as well.
Right. So I think your first iteration of MFA, which is still widely used and very, very common, is your yes no prompts.
Mhm.
So you set up an MFA, you're a user, you log in, a yes no prompt gets sent to your phone. Did you try and log in? You click a button, right? That one inherently has a lot of gaps because as an outside attacker, if I get valid credentials for a user, I'm just going to sit there and send that prompt over and over and over again. And eventually, either that user is going to go to IT and be like, hey, why is this happening? And IT is going to step in and that'll solve the issue, or the user is going to get fatigued and just say yes to the prompt out of annoyance of it,
Yeah.
the continuous pop up.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I will say too, first of all, everybody should have MFA on everything. Like let's just level set with that, right? But also, there have frequently been scenarios where we're password spraying an environment, we get an account and it doesn't have MFA, or MFA has been enforced, but since the user has never logged in,
yep,
we're able to be the first person to register the MFA device. And so, that is absolutely a gap. Even in it doesn't matter how awesome your MFA is. And so, like more advanced current versions of MFA use number matching, which I think is fantastic. Google just went to number matching, by the way, like in the last couple of weeks. Microsoft's been using number matching for some time. There are some other MFA implementations. What's the one that by default comes out and is vulnerable to prompt bombing? You know what I'm talking about? It's another MFA. But anyway, so all MFA is not created equal. Just because you flip the switch and turn MFA on across the board doesn't mean that all your users are signed up and stuff like that. So you really need to be cognizant of that. And then on top of all of those things, you know, um, we still find users that just don't have MFA at all. Even
yep.
though, we'll have that conversation in the kickoff call with clients, and then it comes to find out there's an exception group, or, the policy is only applied to this group, and maybe users aren't a member of that group. And so, we frequently find gaps in that, unfortunately for folks.
Yeah, I'd say, a vector that would be particularly susceptible to this would be universities and higher education, since
Yeah.
they're onboarding so many users at once. And typically, there is a gap in that deployment before you're forced to add login to enable MFA. So that's been a huge vector for us in terms of success with MFA bypasses and just being able to enable it ourselves.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And again, it scales with the size of the organization. Universities and hospitals are huge, and they have a ton of turnover. And even other larger organizations, it's just tough. It's tough to manage all that. So I know we spent a lot of time talking about that. I still think that is probably where most folks could improve the best, or the most. And so, let's move on. So we kind of covered the authentication aspect of it. So what about post authentication, or attacking the authentication itself using like session hijacking, man in the middle stuff? So
Yeah, we could briefly let's touch on session hijacking. So for those of you who don't know, session hijacking would be an attacker capturing a user's session token, and then using that session token to go to various places that usually take authentication and just using the token to prove identity instead of having to authenticate to those apps or what have you.
yeah. Yeah, and this is kind of taking advantage of the fact that we're SSOing everything, right? And I'm a big proponent of single sign on everything. It gives you a single federated location to manage all your users and apply policies and all that good stuff. But it does create some opportunity for things like session hijacking. This is usually a heavier lift for the bad guys, and so it requires them to basically have access to the users, the machine or the device or the application that they're authenticating from, right? That's where that transmission of the session data is coming from. And so we see this take the form of things like browser extensions, malicious browser extensions, or looking at things like B framework, which is an exploit framework written in JavaScript designed to be embedded into websites. It's particularly good at doing session hijacking. And so, the point of all of that is to say the bad guy has to be in the browser, right? Or the bad guy has to be on the device in order for an attack like this to be successful. And there are other prevention mechanisms that can be put into place. So we don't see this executed as often, I will tell you, in my previous life in the banking world, we saw this all the flipping time. It was super common because this was in you know, the first, section of the 2000s when online banking was really big, and the security state of browsers was not really great. There's a lot of malware floating around out there, and banking Trojans were really good at infiltrating the browser, stealing sessions, and we even saw in some cases where the attackers would actually tunnel through the browser to the online banking site. So the session would still be appearing to come from the same browser, same IP, everything. And then when we would go do our investigation, we're like, dude, it's the user did this, right? It looked exactly like the user was doing it. And then under further investigation, we realized the user's system was being used as a proxy. So this can get pretty advanced. We're not seeing this as much anymore because session security is taken pretty seriously, and there are a lot of prevention mechanisms in place for it.
I also think attackers are lazy, you know?
Sure, of course they are. Yeah, man.
And I
Path
think
of least resistance, right?
Yep. Yep. And I think, if we're going to play on social engineering type attacks, because, an attacker has to get a foothold onto a user's computer or browser to start the attack, and I think if they're going to go through the trouble of doing that, why not just send them a malicious payload to, get further into their account environment, get credentials, things of that
Yeah, I
nature.
agree. I agree. And that's where the man in the middle attacks, or, adversary in the middle attacks come into play. This is similar to session hijacking in that the attacker is facilitating the creation of the session, but what they're really doing is spinning up a malicious page that looks and smells like a legitimate Microsoft login page. And as the user is interacting with it in real time, the attacker is actually on the back end sending that session, not the session, but sending the credential information. They'll even prompt the user for MFA information, capture that, and send it in real time so that they can create that session on their end. And so it functions mechanically like a session hijack. It just requires the user to give up, creds, MFA, stuff like that on a malicious page.
Right. Yeah, and I think another vector for that attack is like typo squatted domains. Because
Mhm.
if you're going to leverage a user to go to a phishing page like that, having a typo squatted page that's usually SSO'd in your organization and sending that to a user as a legitimate login can be a great vector for that.
Oh yeah, that's it's pretty close to what we're doing on our social engineering engagements, right? Is we'll go register a website that's either similar to the company name or shares similarities with someone they do business with, and then we'll leverage that. So it's a legitimate website. It's got a real certificate. It looks and smells good, and then it's asking for auth. So yeah, this is definitely in play right now. It's happening in the wild. So similar to that kind of vein, we'll talk about OAuth phishing really quick. And so, it's functionally similar to the adversary in the middle type attack where we're setting up the fake domain. But instead, what we're doing is we're creating a real Azure application that is malicious in nature, and we're asking users to register the application. And so by default, users in Azure currently have the ability by default to enable enterprise applications or authorize enterprise applications. And basically what that means is they can sign into that application via SSO. The downside to that is if they give up permissions, the appropriate permissions, then the attacker can basically access everything that the user has access to, right? Or the user's data is probably the better way to say that. So you can access
Yeah.
their email, you can read their documents that are hosted online, and so you can basically get through all the user's data. And there are some limitations to that, but generally speaking, the user's doing all the work for the bad guy here because they're just authorizing the malicious app. Um, so, there are some mitigations for that as well. You can disable that, but by default, users can register enterprise apps.
Yeah. I think another big thing that we've ran into that has been great points of attack for, after we compromise credentials is those legacy authentication protocols or legacy endpoints that are
Yep.
sitting out on the internet.
Mhm.
Um, I think most commonly we see NTLM endpoints, and those are not endpoints that are properly secured or MFA'd by default.
Yep.
So, say you have a great MFA implementation, every single user is opted in. If an attacker finds these endpoints, if they're not secured by a third party MFA such as Duo or Okta, then, that's going to be an avenue of attack into your environment.
Yep. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It baffles my mind that we're still running NTLM over HTTP. like, what are we doing with our lives, And NTLM is an ancient protocol, and so I think it would be classified by the DMV as an antique at this point. You'd have to register it with an antique tag, but yeah, I mean, it's wild, but it's still out there. We still see it. What I'd say once a month, right? Like it's pretty
Yeah, I
routine.
mean, if people are using remote desktop, the built-in Microsoft remote desktop that you can throw up in a browser, generally we see RPC open, so that
Mhm,
remote procedure call. I think
mhm.
that has to be open for RDP to work in the form that it does. And then if you have on-prem Exchange, I don't know why you would, but that very commonly has those endpoints enabled too.
Yeah. Two things you shouldn't have is RDP and legacy exchange on the internet.
Yeah.
It's a bad day, or it's a good day for us, right? We have a wonderful time doing the pen test on those engagements, but yeah, yeah. So definitely the legacy auth protocols. Something that folks might not be familiar with are application passwords. They can take the form of a number of different things, right? They can be a string that is used for applications to communicate between each other. We frequently see those in API implementations. In fact, we were doing a mobile penetration test last week, and their API was leveraging an application password, and it's different from like a JWT, right? It's not what you're used to seeing when you're generating or creating authentication tokens. This is a static value that an application uses to communicate to other applications. It's not designed for users to authenticate with. It's not designed really for even mobile apps to communicate with, right? Because we control the mobile app and the execution of it. But yeah, so app passwords are generally used to communicate between applications, but they can become compromised, right? We found them in GitHub on client engagements before.
Yep. Yeah,
So
and typically those app passwords bypass MFA completely.
yeah, yeah, and they create some challenges too, right? Because we have all these mechanisms in place across the enterprise for monitoring user activity, for monitoring privilege escalation and lateral movement and all of these things. But then you have this like shadowy dark area sitting over in the corner of your environment that's full of like API keys that are full of static, service accounts and app passwords because they're just very difficult to rotate. They're hard to manage. You can't monitor them the same way, and so they just kind of create a visibility problem, I think, for organizations, and that's why we love seeing them because they're a great opportunity for us to access to get that initial access.
Yep.
All right. So last thing kind of on the list, let's talk about um, conditional access. And this isn't really a vulnerability or a way that we gain access so much as it is just a discussion around the concept of it and the frankly the lack of implementation of conditional access that we see. Right. So
Mhm.
what is conditional access at a high level and why are we, concerned about it?
Yeah, conditional access policies are policies that you set up. So a user has to satisfy X, Y, or Z requirements in order to authenticate to their account. So in some cases, they'll have to come from a certain device. They'll have to be in a certain region, and they'll have to come from a certain IP, right? Depending on how granular you set up your conditional access policies, determines how many gates a user has to step through in order to pass authentication.
Yep. Yeah, these are basically like if then statements, right? And so it's just a logic flow that the users have to get yeses for all of them in order to successfully log in. And like you said, it can just be as simple as, hey, we don't allow logins from North Korea, right? Because our people don't visit there. And so, we see this underutilized, I think, in a lot of places because we typically, when we're doing password attacks or credential attacks of any kind, we're sending this up through AWS, right? We're like proxying this through multiple proxies, and it's coming from all over the US. So you might see one user trying to log in from New York, Chicago, and Western Europe. If you're looking at an attack that we're launching, that in and of itself, qualifies as what we would call impossible travel, right? There's actually a default rule that exists within the environment. And so a lot of times we don't see that enforced. And so, the user normally logs in from, Florida, and suddenly it's trying to log in from three different places all over the country. So That's a really good policy to have in place. But there are other policies too. You can put in like time of day policies, right? Like I don't want my users logging in M365 between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. You know, and so there's just a lot of gates that you can put up to prevent different types of attacks. So
Yeah, but it's only as effective as you make it.
right,
Sometimes we see organizations get fatigued from having to set up exceptions and travel policies because users are only supposed to log in from the US, and then you've got people frequently traveling.
yeah,
And then, we've seen organizations throw their hands up, whatever, everybody can log in from anywhere. And
yeah.
then, an attacker can creep in from Russia, and then suddenly they're in because you slacked on the conditional access policies that you had forced on your users.
Yeah, and it's not foolproof either because you can have attackers run VPNs and proxies that pop out. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we do when we're doing social engineering attacks for MFA prompt bombing and stuff is we'll actually buy a proxy that has the endpoint coming out in the city that the user's in. And so, when we're building target packages on users for spear phishing, we'll go out and find, hey, where do they live? Oh, well, cool, they live in Atlanta. Well, then I'm going to buy a VPN that dumps out in Atlanta, and we'll get as close to their neighborhood as we can, so that if it does come under scrutiny, that it'll pass the sniff test as best as we can make it. So it's not foolproof, but it is certainly one of many different layers. All these attacks that we're talking about have multiple defenses, and implementing that layered approach is absolutely the way to go for all this stuff. Nothing is going to be the silver bullet here.
Right.
All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. Like I said, if you like what we're doing, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll see you guys next Wednesday.